So good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good day, whenever you may be watching this archived video cast of the board responsibilities. My name is Lisa Presley. I'm the district executive of the Heartland District in the Mid-America region, and it's my delight to be with you to go over a bunch of questions and comments about how it is that the board, your boards can function well in this setting and in this work. So I just want to let you know we'll be doing that. As we begin this evening, I'd like to ask you to either, if you have a chalice in front of you, light it, or to light a virtual chalice as I begin with a reading. And this evening's reading is from activist Dorothy Day. She writes, "People say, what is the sense of our small effort? They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. A pebble cast into a pond causes ripples that spread in all directions. Each one of our thoughts, words, and deeds is like that. No one has a right to sit down and feel hopeless. There is too much work to do." And I choose that reading in order to help you understand that although we'll be talking about a lot of things, and you may either tonight feel as if your board is doing a great job, or you might feel as if there are many issues that you need to deal with, again, you aren't allowed to feel hopeless because it is work that just goes brick by brick. I always like to remind people that how it is that a chihuahua eats an elephant, and that's one bite at a time. In tonight's, let me tell you, I am a lifelong Unitarian Universalist, and I'm in my 21st year of ministry with our association as well. And I've served almost every position in lay leadership in our congregations before I ended up being the district executive and the minister. Someone is asking, how do you make the see the entire slide? Is there a way to make it bigger? If you look at the bottom of that, there is the slide section. There is a box with arrows to the edges, and I believe that enlarges your viewing area. But if that doesn't do it, I'm sorry, I can't quite. I'm not sure how to make that technical adjustment at this point for you. But this evening, I just want to give you a brief tour of where we will be going. First of all, I will be talking about what is a board, what is the job of the board. Then we'll be going into three types of the work that a board does: the fiduciary, strategic, and generative. I'll then switch gears a bit and go into the risks that can trap a board into functioning not well. I'll review some best practices, and then I'll talk a bit both about orientation of board members and evaluation of that boards can do. And as a final part, I will also be doing the type of policies, because often congregations will ask, what types of policies should we have? So that's just sort of to let you know where we're going to be going on this roadmap. First thing I want to talk about is, what is the board? Now, most of you who are on this call probably are already board members, or you've been asked to serve on a board and you're trying to figure out what the heck does that mean. I'm delighted that we have some entire boards watching this together tonight so that you can have lots of conversations about this as time goes on. But if you don't already know this, you're in trouble, which is that the board is a body of people who are committed to the well-being of the congregation, and it's of the entire congregation. What is also true about you, and what sometimes people forget, is that you're also the legal entity responsible for the congregation. Although in our congregational polity, the members of the congregation are the ones who have the final say, the board stands instead of the congregation at the times in which they are not in equal or in session. And so you are really sort of first among equals. It is a representative form of democracy, and it is something that comes out of both corporate law and also our sense of covenant with each other. Many of you will be in congregations where you are incorporated, and so that you will find that the state or commonwealth in which you are incorporated, or I believe we may even have someone online from England tonight, that the provincial, or probably not provincial government there, I'll have to bone up on my English differentiations of governance, but that you will be granted by the state or the government certain powers. But you also get your power of decision-making through the congregational bylaws as well. There will be the documents that your congregation has created that outlines what are the limits and strengths of your work. There's also then the tradition in history, both in Unitarian Universalism, where we do go by congregational polity, but with a representative form, and also by the particular culture of your congregation. I'm always intrigued to find out what it is that some boards are allowed to do in some congregations that in another congregation they would not be granted the authority to do that. The line between the decisions that a board can make and what things must be referred to the congregation for decision varies greatly depending on what the history and tradition of your congregation is and how you wrestle with the questions of authority and trust. But the biggest responsibility that the board has overall is that you are responsible for the entirety of the congregation. And this is true even if you are in boards that work as a liaison to or you're elected as representatives of particular areas of the congregation. When you're on a board, one of the things you must do is give up the specificity of whatever dream, desire, or role you have, and instead look at what is happening in its entirety. So the jobs of the board, as I said, one of them is fiduciary, and that's the duty of care that you have and the loyalty to the mission of the congregation and obedience to those foundational documents. Now, some people will say that, well, the church is owned by the members, and actually another way to think about that is that you are actually owned by the mission, by what it is you're called to do in the world, how you interact with the community around them. And so that is another part of that care. You are responsible, some will say, to the children of the children who are currently there. You don't just own the congregation by those who are there. It's also strongly recommended that congregations govern by policy. Rather than having to make a decision about every single issue that comes up in congregational life, the board job is to set broad policy under which other people and other bodies can make decisions, whether that be any staff or committee structure that you have. Part of those policies is the separation of those duties and the delegating of the responsibility and the authority appropriately. If you are making someone responsible for something, one of the things that you should also do in your policies is make it so that they have the authority to carry out that responsibility. So if you make someone, say, chief of staff, then you also have to give them the authority to be able to make decisions about staffing. That doesn't mean they go off and do everything on their own, but that they spend time, bringing people along with them. But people need the tools for their job, and that includes a clear definition of who is responsible for what, and also what authority they have to do this, to do the various particular things that they're being asked to do. So as I was saying, the job of the board then is to get up onto the balcony and to look at the entire dance floor of the congregation, not just look at one particular segment, but to have an overarching view of the congregation. You need to also spend your time on the open questions, the ones that don't have any particular easy answer. And these are questions such as, who are we, where are we going, and what is next for our congregation? The board is responsible, as I said, for these three different but related obligations: the fiduciary or duty of care, the strategic, the duty for planning, and the generative, the duty of forward thinking and doing the work that no one else in the congregation can do. You'll see the reference here to Governance is Leadership, which is a book by Chait. And the last slides in this presentation is a bibliography of a few reference sources for you. And that is one that I find that is very helpful in helping a nonprofit board understand what your responsibilities are. It really doesn't matter whether you are a board that is constructed under something such as the Carver Policy Governance Model, or if you are working under a more traditional form of governance. All boards have these three things that they are responsible for. And so I will now go a bit more into that. The fiduciary responsibility is what a lot of people immediately think of when you are thinking about what is it that a board does. And this can be summarized as the duty of loyalty and care for the congregation. There's a variety of ways that you check the congregation to make sure it's actually headed in the way that it should be headed. There's the financial oversight to make sure that there's no waste, theft, or misuse, and to make sure that your resources are being used in the best way possible. Part of the job of this is, well, do we build space? Do we rent space? Do we, and are we putting our resources in ways that line us up with that mission? And the next point there is that mission oversight. Congregations do need to articulate the reason for your existence. What is your mission? What difference do you want to make in the world for which people? And so then once that is determined, then you also need to make sure that you are doing the mission and that you don't lead the congregation or the congregation lead the board unintentionally into areas that have no relationship to the mission. You might end up in some very good and interesting places, but if you are not checking to make sure that it actually is where you intend to go, then you are falling down a bit in this fiduciary responsibility. There's also the responsibility to make sure that any foreseeable harm is mitigated against. So that's making sure that you have the policies and procedures that provide for safety for the people in your congregation, that you make sure that you have insured the property, and in other ways make sure that the congregation does not suffer any kind of loss as much as you can reasonably foresee. So you can't necessarily change the force of nature and make sure that no wind, rain, hail, snow, sleet gets into your property, but you can make sure that you are protecting yourself so that any damage that happens is the smallest amount of damage that could occur. The fiduciary responsibilities are not only legal imperatives, but it's also a sense of moral and practical imperatives. It is your job to do this not only because by law you should be doing it, but because the right thing to do is to treat people equitably, fairly, to make sure that your policies and procedures do not discriminate against individuals or groups of people. In addition to that, one of the key responsibilities of the board is to set the tone and tenor of how the congregation is, should be, and could be. How are you as board members living out the covenant of your congregation? How are you making sure that you are modeling communication that is appropriate with members of the congregation, that there's transparency in the work that you're doing, and that people in the congregation can have a sense of how the congregation is doing? This also involves your own personal commitments about how you are involved in the congregation. Board members have the responsibility, in my opinion, to be active participants in the congregation. It's not enough just to serve on the board, but it's to be there and be active in the congregation through regular attendance, through pledging, through how you talk to newcomers on Sundays or whenever your church services are, and to make sure that you're out there as the face of the congregation, showing the welcome and hospitality that you desire to have in your congregation. When you are a board member, you really are a trustee who's holding the assets in trust, as I said earlier, for the future generations. This is also what's called technical work. Within the work of Ron Heifetz, who is from the Harvard Business School. He has looked at and has identified both this classification of work into either technical or adaptive work. Technical work is work for which there is a known solution to a problem, and adaptive work is work where the answer is not clearly visible to people. The example I usually use, because people can understand this one and because I haven't figured out the one that's quite as clear from congregational life, is I talk about plumbing. Now, when your toilet breaks, you usually know either how to fix it yourself or how to call a plumber to come and fix the toilet. And that's a technical fix because there's a particular, toilets work in a particular way, and there's very simple ways once you know how to fix them. So that would be a technical challenge. An adaptive challenge is a challenge for which there is no known answer. And so, stretching this analogy a bit further, before there were toilets, the adaptive challenge was how do we deal with accumulated human waste when we live in communities of a number of people? And before they had designed the sewer system and all of that, that was an adaptive challenge because we did not know how to deal with such a complex situation. So every technical situation now was probably at one point an adaptive challenge where people did not know the answer. And so the fiduciary responsibilities are that technical challenge for the situation. It's things that we know how to do it. You might not know how to review a financial statement, but someone does who can teach you how to do that. Very different than when they first created the dual entry bookkeeping system, for example. So there are skills that if you don't have are readily trainable to you as a board member on how to do this technical work. So here are some of the questions that you would ask when you are in your fiduciary role. And they are questions such as, do our systems and procedures in congregational life protect the congregation from financial loss or downturn? Then are we protecting the people from physical, psychological, or spiritual harm? Are we protecting our children and other vulnerable adults from abuse by having policies and safety guidelines that we follow and expect volunteers to follow when working with them? How are we protecting our buildings or campus from loss and destruction? And how are we protecting ourselves from being sued for things over which we should have control? There are questions, too, around are there surpluses that we can use or should be using, or should we be building up our surplus? Do we do a rolling average of income from fundraising or investment income? What that would mean is you would take a period of several years and you would drop a quarter off and add a quarter each time so that it's a rolling average so that you don't take all the windfall or all the loss in just one financial period, but instead spread that out over time. Another question is, are you fully insured, both for the property, but do you also have directors and officers insurance? By stepping onto boards, people become liable legally for their actions. And as long as the board is acting in good faith with not, figuring out the knowledge that you need to do to have this, you will not have someone who successfully sues you. But all comprehensive congregational insurance policies should have directors and officers insurance. And if you don't know whether or not yours does, I would recommend that you check that out. If you are insured through Church Mutual, the one that many of our UU congregations use, then you would be covered for that policy. And then another question, too, is when you have policies in place, are you reviewing them on a regular basis so that you will figure out what is going on there? And I seem to have bumped forward one slide. There we go. I'll go back to the fiduciary ones. So are you making sure that you have the policies that are being reviewed on an annual or other sequence, like every 2 or 3 years? Are there any questions about the fiduciary responsibilities? Again, if you have one, it's *6 to unmute yourself, or you can type it into the chat box. Just give a moment for anyone to unmute. Okay, I don't hear any questions. So let me then move along to the strategic responsibilities. The strategic responsibilities is when we shift from being merely internally focused, looking only at our internal operations, to looking at the possibilities that belong outside of the walls of our congregation. The strategic plan, this also involves strategic planning or long-range planning to figure out about how you want to get from point A to point B, and also what are point A's or point B's. It is looking at that bigger picture of the congregation's future that takes into account not only who may be in your doors, but also how is the world changing around you. What is your neighborhood looking like? What is the culture of religion looking like in the country? What do you have to set up in your plan so that you will not become obsolete as you go along by ignoring the strengths and opportunities, weaknesses, and threats that may exist on you? And so looking for where you're going and what you could be doing, not just what you have done. And it's a focus that really stretches you out about 3 to 5 years, not just in the day-to-day, but to see what's going on. And this is when you are beginning to move from the technical to the adaptive challenges. Now, one of the things that when we enter the realm of adaptive challenges is that it makes everybody feel stupid. Because what you're doing is you're moving out of the area of having certainty about where you're going, what you're doing, who you are, to the questioning of what is next and what is possible. And you're stepping out of your natural skill base or your learned way of dealing with things to figure out how do things look different. And so you got to give yourself a bit of slack when you're in this to make sure that you all are probably feeling a bit over your head when you get to an adaptive issue. Many issues are really mixed, adaptive, and technical, but when you feel yourself floundering and you don't really know what's going on and you feel like an idiot, think, perhaps this might be an adaptive challenge that we're dealing with. So the questions that you look at with your strategic hat on as board members is, where should we or who should we be 3 to 5 years from now? And what is our mission and how do we achieve it? You would look at what processes do you want to have to help your congregation come to an understanding of the mission, and how will they help you form and shape that? And then what's the trajectory? Where do we expect that we're actually moving and going? It is looking at those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and also looking about how can we build not only for who is here now, but for what we imagine the future will be. You need to be able to look at how do you as a board help the congregation move forward. If you are only responding to things that are happening in the congregation rather than helping the congregation dream bigger, then you're skipping the strategic part. It's your responsibility to help the congregation plot its future forward. That includes training new leaders, making sure that there's a system for replacement of yourselves, bringing people in and moving forward. Another part of this strategic questioning is to begin to ask, are you using your resources appropriately? Are you spending your time, energy, money, and staffing priorities on the right things? Or are there other things, opportunities that you're missing that you maybe need to move forward on? The third part of the third hat that you put on as a board member is that of the generative. And this is some of the most tricky to figure out because we're very comfortable with the fiduciary usually, somewhat comfortable with the strategic, but the generative can often leave us with a sense of what is it we're really supposed to be doing. And you'll see that on this slide it talks about how the fiduciary and strategic are what we call management, and the generative is leadership. That's where you ask the deeper, broader questions that too often don't get asked because we get tied up in the minutia of or as I refer to as the administrivia of church leadership. So what is it that you could be? What else is possible are the big questions here. It's hard to wrap your arms around this, but it's beyond who we are today. what might we be called to do in the world? Where is it that, in the words of Frederick Buechner, our greatest desires meet the world's hunger? And that doesn't need to be literal hunger, but what is it that the world is calling out for that you as a congregation are ideally suited to supply and support in the world around you? It's thinking outside the box, not thinking, okay, that congregational life has to be like X, but to begin to expand, what would congregational life look like if we to embrace technology in a more robust way? Would we be video casting? Would we be reaching out? How do we help organize the people in our congregation? What do we do to spread Unitarian Universalism longer or wider? And this is really the longer-term vision, that 5 to 10 years, in looking at it in the response to the changing nature of society. If you're not already familiar with the Faith Formation 2020, year 2020 that is, work, I would recommend that you Google that or check on our MidwestUUleadership.org site to make sure that you can see the workshops we've done on that. Faith Formation 2020 looks at what have been the trends and change in religion in this country over the past 20 to 40 years. And how do we equip ourselves as congregations to move forward into the year 2020, still being relevant? Many of our congregations are still organized following the work and religious practices of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And if you haven't noticed it, religious life and what people are looking for has changed radically since then. And Faith Formation 2020 will help you understand that. But what is never clear when you're dealing with the generative responses is that there is one particular answer. There's always a multiplicity of answers, and your job when you have your generative hat on is helping your congregation figure out where it is you want to go. It's sort of the vision, mission writ large. And you have to make sure that you are communicating well with your congregation on this, that you're listening to them, that you're educating them, and you're educating yourself about these future trends and understanding. And the generative work, too, is the work that the board alone can do because of your overarching global view of congregational life, rather than looking particularly at the religious education program or the music program or the pastoral care program or the various areas. It allows you that sense to be able to look broadly and deeply at what could be and figure out what is next and not just rely upon what has happened in the past. And so some of the questions that can help you look at this is, what will be most strikingly different about our congregation 5 years from now? And so that's the question of what will be. The next question is similar, but it's what you hope will be most different. Who do you want to look like? What do you want to be? What do you want to be about? And then the other question is, if you were 5 years from now looking back, what is the thing that your board right now could do that would help your congregation be more relevant, more viable 5, 10, 15 years from now, so that they look back and say, this was the signature moment when the board took a step that helped us become who we are today? That's a very big question, and it's not one that you can answer in 15 minutes at a board meeting. But you need to make sure that you do allow time for generative work at all your board meetings, and maybe have a retreat or two every once or twice a year, so that you can look at these questions outside of the context of your ordinary work as board members. Some of the other questions are, what is possible for us? Who sees the situation differently? In other words, who's not at the table who might have another view of what's happening both in society and in your congregation writ large? If you don't have much diversity in your congregation, you might want to think about or ask people to give you their sense who might represent those other diversities, whether they be people of color, LGBT folks, different generations, or whomever. And then looking also at what's the biggest gap between who we claim we are and what we actually do. Most of us know, even from just saying our resolutions at New Year's, that we have this dream and ideal that, yes, we'll go to the gym every day, but we find that we really are only going there, once every 3 weeks. What's that gap in your congregation between your resolutions of who you want to be and your actual practice? And another way to look at this is, what headline would we like to see about ourselves? Would we like other people to be looking at? If we were to be able to write the newsletter story. Or another question is, how are we viewed and understood by people in our community? When you say to people, we're from the UU Church of East Cupcake, what is their first thought about who you are? You might find as a board that it's helpful to have some conversation with people outside of your congregation to get a sense of how you're seen in the larger world. So it's these sort of mind-opening questions that are the generative part of the work. Much of your time as a board will be spent on the fiduciary and the strategic, but if you are not dedicating time to look at these generative questions, you're missing part of your job. And it's not a good idea to leave these big questions to the last 20 minutes of your board meeting, because by then, if you're like most boards, I know your brains will be dead and you won't be able to look as expansively as you could. This is where retreats can also help very greatly, because you can get out of your ordinary everyday space and look around and see yourselves differently. Is there any question about the fiduciary, strategic, or generative aspects of board work? Again, it's *6 if you need to unmute, or you can type them in. Okay, I don't hear anything, so we'll go along, switching gears now to talk about what are the risks that face boards. And there's many ways that boards can get trapped in their governance style. The first one is a big one, is when boards confuse making people happy with living out the mission of the church. That there are times when people will actually ask you to do something, or you will feel the natural desire to want to make people happy. But sometimes the way that people are happy is by not allowing any change to happen in the congregation. And you can also then pander sometimes to people's fears or prejudices. I remember years and years ago now, the concern was that if women were ministers, all they would ever talk about would be feminist ideas. When gay and lesbian people came in more strongly into our ministry, there was the concept that all they'll ever do is talk about LGBT rights, and they won't be able to understand me. And then there's also the same kind of fears that often get expressed around ministers of color, that's all they'll be focused on, or ministers with disabilities or other people. Those kinds of fears that we realized were unfounded. Of course, you don't want a single-issue person on any of those, but to do that kind of categorical thinking can be difficult. And so one of the things that the boards can get in trouble and help their congregations be in trouble is that if you respond to the fears of the people around you and their prejudices and don't allow themselves to be educated. There's a story that James Luther Adams, one of our notable theologians from the last century, that being the 20th century, used to tell. He was a member of First Unitarian Church in Chicago during the height of their efforts to figure out whether or not to integrate this congregation. And there was one board meeting that Jim would talk about, where there was somebody who was arguing vehemently against making their congregation inclusive of people, of African Americans. And eventually someone turned to that person and said, "What is the purpose of the church?" And the fellow thought for a moment, and he said, "The purpose of the church is to get hold of people like me and change us." And so one of the things that you have to make sure is that you're not allowing the fear of people to keep you in place. Another problem that you can run into is that you might become so expert at governance and at running the church and doing all of that that you forget that you have a religious mission. Our religious mission doesn't have to be about God, though it's fine if it is. But the religious mission is to be something more than just a very well-run organization. You have to make sure that you remember that your job is to transform people and the world, and that's what Unitarian Universalism has been about throughout its history. And another one, although this is a lesser tendency in congregations, but it still does happen, is sometimes you can get so caught up in developing policies because that's a concrete product that you forget to live out the mission. And so you have to be careful to make sure that you are actually looking at what the mission is and not just at the jobs and the tasks. Sometimes it's so much easier to deal with those tasks than to ask those deeper questions. So those are some of the risks, but there's also a variety of ways that governance can work in your congregation. The first thing to remember is that there is no one right way to carry out governance. Yes, you have to look at the fiduciary, the strategic, and the generative, but how you do that in your congregation will shift and vary depending on your culture, depending on who you are as a people and where you want to be. It will also vary, I can tell you, depending on the level of trust you have in the congregation and how comfortable you are with authority and ambiguity. If you've not done the work on trust and authority issues, then you're going to have a very definite form of governance that is probably not very permission-giving, but is more one that tries to hold people in check. So that's some of the work you get to do as a board as well. Generally, though, you're looking for a unified structure for making governance decisions. How are we going to do, or what is it that we're going to be doing? And this would be questions about mission, vision, and evaluation. And you're also looking for a unified structure of making operational decisions. How are you going to decide how to do the things that you've decided to do? Sometimes this is separated between staff and laity or not, but you need to be clear and articulate what is the vision for this. One of the best resources I know to really understand and look at this whole thing about the difference between governance and ministry or operational decisions is Dan Hotchkiss's book, Governance and Ministry. There's a reference to that on that bibliography, but he takes the work of the congregation and helps people understand that often in congregational life we are playing multiple roles with each other. And he helps figure out how boards can sort of sort their way through that well. The other thing to do is to make sure that you have a creative, open atmosphere for ministry and government. You are, again, about the transformation of the people and the world. So learning how to be a permission-giving board, for example, where when there is a group of people who want to bring something forward that is consistent with your mission, you help them figure out creative ways of doing that, and you don't just put up roadblocks because we've never done it that way before. Now, I know that in your congregations, none of you have ever heard that phrase, but we don't do that here. And yet, you know, in some congregations it does happen. That's a small joke for you all. Another thing that's very important to do is to make sure that you have clarities about jobs and job descriptions. This is not just for paid staff, but it's for volunteers as well. What are the jobs that are expected to be done? What is the description of that? What limitations are there on people doing the work? Do you have job descriptions for your board members, for the chairs of any of your committees or task forces? Do you have job descriptions for your key volunteer roles and for your staff? Those need to be in place, and they need to articulate, again, where the authority and responsibility come along, and also what is it that is allowed or is not allowed to be done by those people. So being clear about that, and so that, you know, I remember that there were people who've been often drafted for boards. I hear these stories over and over again, or committee chairs who say, gosh, I didn't know what was expected of me. That doesn't lead to good governance in any structure. And so being able to provide somebody with a job description that includes also what term limit there might be and how they can get out of the job once they're in it is a good thing. One of my colleagues in the Mid-America region says, you know, I never sing in the church choir because as a male, it becomes a life sentence because there are so few men often in our church choirs. So thereby, he's very hesitant about that. So you have to make sure that not only can you get people into positions, but they have an easy way to transition out. And that's part of this overall recruitment and leadership development program. Congregations that have good leadership development find that it's much easier to fill the positions on their board and in other leadership structures, because what you do is you bring people on bit by bit. You train them in what the skill base that they will need as they move through the governance structure and volunteer structure of your congregation. There's a great resource called Harvest the Power on the UUA.org website, and that's part of the Tapestry of Faith curriculum. Everything there is available online, and it is a leadership development program for use in your congregation to help you figure out how to bring along those leaders. You always want to make sure that you're taking people one step further as they go along. Another thing that helps make governance work is the orientation of new members in your governing structure. And so that's both to the life of the church so they understand what they're doing. I always am a little concerned when someone jumps on a board after only being a Unitarian Universalist for 6 months. Sometimes they might not have inculcated the culture and understand that. Now, there's also a good side is that they can see things that perhaps those of us who've been around forever won't see because they do come with beginner eyes. But if you bring someone in who doesn't really understand the nature of Unitarian Universalism yet, that can be problematic. So you want to make sure that all your new board members are oriented to the life of the church and also the physical plant. I'll be talking in more specifics about orientation later on that. But it's also to the board and its operations. So what's the history, policy, the covenant, the expectations in being a board member? Another thing that is always helpful is to have evaluation of your performance as board members. How are you stacking up against the expectations that are set? How well are you doing? This includes the board's self-evaluation and a time for the board to talk among themselves about how are you doing? Are you living out the covenant that you've created with each other as board members? And I'll be talking more about this again in just another slide or two. Going more in depth in the orientation, one of the things that you want to do is to orient them to the position. Again, what are the expectations? What are the documents that they need to know about? Is there a policy book? Many congregations have tons of policies they have passed in over the years, but they don't have a compendium of them. And so boards end up revisiting the same issue again and again as if it's for the first time. So you want to make sure that you have all your policies in a book that you can figure out and look at on a regular basis. What is the scope or limitation of their work in that particular position? A big conversation that needs to have is the conversation about confidentiality. Much of the work of the board does, or not much, but there are aspects of board work that do include confidentiality. Sometimes you're talking about personnel issues, for example, are one big area where there is confidentiality. There are laws and rules about what congregations can say and cannot say about this. I would commend to you the webinar that we did earlier this year on human resources for congregations. That's available up on our webinar that can help you on this. But many of the conversations about personnel cannot be extended beyond the board executive session level. So the question you have to say is when you're talking about confidentiality, well, what happens when you come home from a meeting and your family member, your spouse or partner asks you about that? Does confidentiality mean you can't say it to those, explain to those people what is going on? And sometimes that's what it means. You have to have that conversation to figure out what are the limits of confidentiality and can you all be on the same page. It also involves the issue of speaking with one voice. If you're not familiar with that phrase, what that means is that boards will often adopt as part of their practice or covenant with each other that once a decision has been made, the board will speak with one voice about it as the board has decided this. During the time up until the decision is made, the board will talk back and forth with each other and express all manner of opinions with each other. That's expected and normal. But once the decision has been made, the board members will all back it regardless of where they were on the vote. So that you will speak with one voice. You will not say things like, well, the rest of the board thought this was a good idea, but I realized it was a disaster. You instead would say, the board has decided this. After good, deep conversation, we came to a conclusion about this one particular item. And so then that's the confidentiality conversation. When you orient them to the congregation, one of the things that you really need to do is talk about the history and what secrets there may be in the closet. We always assume that we know the secrets, but we don't always. And so you have to make sure that there are not things that will come up and will surprise people when they're least looking for it. The board needs to know what the history has been so they don't inadvertently stumble into things. You also have to make sure they know the mission and even give them a tour of the premises. Where are the first aid kits located? How do we get out of the building in case of emergencies? Where are the fire alarms and the fire extinguishers? That's part of the orientation. Evaluation of boards include the programs, practices, and policies. And the big question in that is, are these the right ones for us now? Or should there be other policies that we need to create, or some of these policies that we can let go? Then, as I've already mentioned, you need to look at board performance. Are you doing your job, or are you doing the jobs of that? Oh, and I see someone says about secrets. Let me just go back and answer that question. There are often in congregational life history stories that are told about the congregation that sometimes are not known widely, but might have a great impact on the history of the congregation and the issues that you need to deal with. Often this happens when there has been misperformance by a staff member or by a board member or some other member of the congregation where they have violated the trust of the congregation. This often isn't told in your basic 101 introduction to the congregation that you get in new member orientation, but often having a history of that can help people understand where the touchiness might be in the system. Or as an example, in the Heartland District, one of the things that happened early on in our creation after the creation of Heartland out of Ohio, Meadville, and Michigan districts was that there was a misappropriation of funds by our then administrator to someone who was then prosecuted. But if board members now don't know that there was a misappropriation then, they might not understand why the issue of finances might be a little touchy and why some suggestions about loosening up the standards of care around that could be problematic. What I found very helpful was to understand, going back and looking at the history, that there had also been a misappropriation in the Michigan district back in the 1970s, which explained the reactivity when there was a misappropriation in the early 2000s. And so as a board member, you need to know this stuff so you can understand how the secrets live out in everyday life. Finances are often a touchy area in congregations, but it's even more touchy at the district level because of this history of misappropriation that's there. So that's an example of a secret. So going back to the evaluation, the question of, are you following the covenant that you've set? And is the board doing your job, or is it doing work that should be done by a committee or by a staff person? So looking at that. Each individual board member should look at how are you present in the work that you're doing. Are you remaining open to the whole? What big questions do you need to be looking at as you work through your term on the board? Another big question is, how are you communicating with the congregation? Is there an openness, and is information be able to flow back and forth? One thing I regularly recommend to congregation boards is that you have regular quarterly town hall meetings in which you invite members of the congregation not to come decide anything, but to have a conversation with you so they can know what it is that you are doing. Then we're on the last prepared slide here is what kind of policies is it that you might need for your congregation? And there are 4 basic categories that you can read here: the discernment, strategy, management, and oversight. If you are looking for a sample of a policy book, again, I would refer you back to Dan Hotchkiss's book, Governance and Ministry, produced by the Alban Institute. Dan is a Unitarian Universalist minister, and he understands the nature of our situations and how our congregations work. But it's also writing this for a general audience, so you might have to do a little bit of transition or translation of some of the stuff, but it should be very clearly there. The resource guide, the resources then that I recommend are the Governance is Leadership book I mentioned, Dan's book on governance and ministry. A book that I always recommend that congregational boards read is Peter Steinke's book, Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times, Being Calm and Courageous No Matter What. One of the things that can ramp up the issues in a congregation is when a board responds to something out of anxiety rather than out of a more reasoned response. And so Steinke's work helps you understand what your anxiety triggers are, both personally and as a board, so that you can make sure that you look at what is happening and to make sure that you are responding rationally rather than with perhaps a knee-jerk reaction. But I'm sure that none of you ever do that knee-jerk reaction. And then another one that can help is Ronald Heifetz's Leadership Without Easy Answers, which helps you understand some of that adaptive work. I know I've been sort of going on a monologue with this, but with so many people on it, it's hard to figure out how to make sure I convey the information to you that I wish to do and also have participation. But now is time for open question and answers. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, questions on areas I haven't covered tonight, I would be open to that. You can either type them into the chat or you can unmute your phone by pushing *6. So what questions are burning in your brains?
So Lisa, can we get copies of this PowerPoint so we can skinny it down and create orientation guides for people on incoming boards at our congregation?
You have a PDF of them right now.
Okay.
Or you should have. That was sent out with the instructions. You're looking at, so you could create your own PowerPoint after that, off of that, if you're going to reduce it. But if you wish to have the actual PowerPoint, you can just send me an email, and we can talk about that. So my email address is, the easiest one to remember is lpresley@uua.org, and that's up there. I see that someone posted that you're not able to print the PDF. Again, if you send me those questions directly to my email, I can help you figure out how to get a hard copy of that material.
Okay, thank you very much. By the way, this was Dave Wistrake from the First Unitarian Church of South Bend.
Well, welcome, South Bend. Yes. Any other questions that people have? Anything that doesn't ring true for you? I'm assuming there's somebody who has a different opinion who's on the line. Well, I don't see anybody typing madly away, and I don't hear anyone asking questions. So unless there's some other questions, I think we will end this. You may always email me. Again, at the lpresley@uua.org is the easiest one of my multiple emails to remember, and I can answer other questions for you, or some of your individual district staff may be able to answer those questions as well. So I want to thank you very much for being part of this evening, and just to let you know too, I will be sending out a link to an evaluation so that you can give candid feedback on this presentation, and also let us know what it is that you might just like to see further webinars about, so that you can have the sense of we can learn from what we're doing and make sure that we get in your, okay, we do have Great. There's someone who's asking about other questions for their board retreat. Susan, why don't you drop that in an email to me, and I will see if I can come up with something for you. So I want to thank you all, and again, also thank you for your contributions to both the UUA and to your districts that allow us to carry on webinars like this to help you be better leaders in your congregation. Thank you for all you do for your congregation. They may not thank you often enough, but what you do is valuable and important. So good night, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.